I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight. Many of you are repeaters, so you know that I'm Ann Waltner. I'm chair of the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. We're now well into our second year of the History Book Club, which features presentations by faculty members and by alumni of wonderful, interesting books on a whole wide variety of subjects. And tonight we have Alan Isaacman and Barbara Isaacman talking about their book. Oh, I don't. No, I have it on Kindle and there. It doesn't show very well, does it? Well, anyway, Mozambique, Samora, Machel. Alan Isaacman is a Regents Professor of African History. He's published many books. He's won many prizes with his books. He's trained a whole generation of wonderful, wonderful scholars. And this is his latest contribution to the field. And Barbara Isaacman is a retired attorney. She has worked in the Mozambican women's movement, and she wrote a book called Mozambique Women, the Law, and Agrarian Reform. Before I turn the floor over to the two of them, I do have one more announcement to make, and that is this is how Alan is celebrating his birthday. So I'm sure that we all wish Alan a very happy birthday. I didn't promise him we wouldn't sing, but I think we probably won't sing, but just wish you a happy birthday, Alan. So I will now turn the floor over to you, Alan and Bobby.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne, and thanks to all of you who are participating. I would just add that Bobby has an undergraduate major or joint major in Latin American history, so she's part of our historical family, and more relevantly, she has an ABD in African sociology. She was halfway through her dissertation when she decided to go to law school, and the legal profession is far better for that decision.
For sure.
For sure. Okay. So, and many of you who are good friends of ours will know that Bobby and I often disagree. We've been disagreeing for 57 glorious years, and we hope you find it entertaining. Okay, so let me begin. I'm going to make the talk for about 15 minutes around 3 issues, and then Bobby will correct me. Also, because Bobby is the smarter of the two, direct all the hard questions toward her, and you could send me the softballs questions. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 things: the origins of the project, the significance of Samora Moises Machel, and the challenges of writing a biography of Samora Machel, a man who we knew well and admired. So, in the mid-70s, Samora Machel, first president of Mozambique, was arguably the second most important leader in Africa, most important figure in Africa, second only to Nelson Mandela. And one of the things that's very important, even though many of you may not know about Samora Machel or may only know about him through my conversations with us and my ramblings, yes, is that in 1975, when the Soweto uprisings took place, when Black students marched against the apartheid regime in South Africa, they carried 2 pictures of Nelson Mandela and Samora Moises Machel. Moreover, even though they could not speak a word of Portuguese, or few of them could, they all had their fists high raised in the air, and they were yelling, "A luta continua," the struggle continues, which is how Samora always began and ended each speech. So he's very important, he's very significant in the history of the continent and Mozambique. He was a president who typically addressed crowds and met and was dressed primarily in military fatigues that represented the importance of the armed struggle in the history of Mozambique. But he was also a leader with the most powerful eyes I've ever seen, charismatic, who began every rally of 500 people or 20,000 people by singing. And he would sing the national anthem in 8 or 9 of the indigenous languages in Mozambique, in addition to Portuguese. Fidel Castro once said when visiting Mozambique and hearing Samora Machel sing, he said that Samora Machel is the only leader of the world who could win a revolution by singing, for what it's worth. Okay, so how did we get into this project? Well, the we in the first instance is me, but then Bobby figures very importantly. And so I was first involved, got into the long history through involvement in the civil rights movement, and Bobby was very instrumental in that political formation. Then I went to college at City College in New York, and I really wanted to study African American history, then called the history of the Negro people. I was told that, and I went to school right in the middle of Harlem, I was told that there was no such thing as the African American history, but there was this new thing developing called African history. Would I be interested in that? And so, thinking in terms of the prism of race, through the prism of race, not knowing anything about Africa, I said yes, and the rest is history. I went to, Bobby and I went to University of Wisconsin. We've been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and I chose to write about Mozambique for 2 very different reasons, which reflected the 2 very different parts of me. I chose to write about it because no one, Africanists were writing primarily about British and to a less degree, Francophonic West Africa. No one was writing about Portuguese or Lusophonic Africa. So it was a great opportunity. And second of all, there was an armed struggle going on, which I identified with strongly even then. And so this became an opportunity for me to satisfy my 2 dual commitments and concerns to activism and scholarship. We would
But there was another thing too, sorry to interrupt so soon, but the Portuguese claimed to be different from all other imperial powers because they believed in Luso-tropicalism, which was colorblind. So everybody in the Luso community, and of course that went from Brazil to Macau to Goa to Mozambique, Angola, and several other places in West Africa, they claimed that everybody was equal there, and that really what they were doing was they were bringing a civilizing mission to Africa, and all of the Africans would be part of their empire, and they would all be very happy when they became Portuguese, in essence.
Right.
And of course, what Alan was studying, the Prazos de Coroa, was an institution where people came from the metropole, from Portugal and from Goa, and they took over these estates along the Zambezi River in Mozambique, and over time they became Africanized. So rather than it being a civilizing mission, it was the Africanization of the Europeans, and that was why he chose the topic.
And so actually it became a very sexy subject because this is the period of the 60s when everyone was talking about modernization and culture change and the impact of the West, and what I was showing was the exact opposite. But in any case, Bobby and I went, we were the first people, researchers to get into Mozambique in more than a decade. We went to a very remote area. Bobby was the first woman, white woman that people saw, had ever met. And in fact, some of the women there were very disturbed that we didn't have any children yet.
They thought there was something wrong with me.
And so they wanted to give us some fertility medicines and stuff. So anyway, when we were there, we observed the most brutal, repressive forms of colonialism: whippings, beating, disregard, dehumanizing, etc. So when I came back, I decided right away that I was going to use my unique experience to sort of serve as a voice for Mozambican people. And the first thing I did was to go to New York and met with the Mozambican representative to the United Nations, and then joined the Committee for a Free Mozambique. And in 1975, Mozambique became independent. In 75, we were invited to come to Mozambique. Bobby Bobby,
Just you, I wasn't there.
Bobby was invited to teach in the law school and to work with the Mozambicans women's movement, and I to teach history. And we developed a very interesting relationship with Samora Machel. We were not, I wouldn't say we were close friends with him, but we admired him tremendously and met with him on numerous occasions, both privately and publicly. And there's, even though there's a story I'm going to tell, because Bobby had a joking relationship with Samora, and everyone treated him as the president, Excelentísimo Senor President, etc. And he had a retinue, and we were meeting with him in a whole group of people, and he came over and shook my hand. I had known him much better than Bobby at that point. And he said, "This is Alan Isaacman, our historian," and he said, "This is Barbara Isaacman."
No, that's not how it happened.
This isn't Barbara Isaacman.
That's
the
not how it
worst,
happened.
the worst.
The person who was in charge of protocol introduced us, and they introduced us as Senor Isaacman y Esposa, Alan Isaacman and wife. And I said, "I am not his esposa. He is my husband."
That is not what happened. What happened was Samora did that, but it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that became a long-standing joke between them. I did a lot of work for, as I said, in addition to teaching. I served as a stringer for UPI. I went around and introduced Western journalists, including people like Tom Wyka. I gave them an orientation, but also advised some more when I saw a lot of corruption in the countryside, and about these sort of challenges that Frelimo faced in the United States. So we had a very close relationship, both professional, and we admired him very, very much. So what is significant about Samora? Well, 5 things I think are very, very significant. First, he was a very prominent nationalist leader, but unlike most nationalist leaders of his day who were interested just in capturing the state, he was very concerned about neo-colonialism and the fact that most of the independent states that become independent between 1960 and 75 were in fact not only nominally independent, they were experiencing neo-colonialism. And he was committed to breaking the chains of dependency, not only politically, but economically. Second thing, he was a dedicated Marxist. He came to Marxism not by reading Marx, but through his lived experiences in an oppression in the colonial period. Third, unlike Julius Nyerere, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Leopold Senghor, all of them went to Cambridge, Oxbridge, or American universities. He only had a 3rd grade education. He is what Frantz Fanon referred to as the classic revolutionary. Now, let me just tell you a couple of things about Samora's life, because it's his life which shapes his revolutionary thinking and politics. He was born in southern Mozambique in 1933. His father was forced to work in the gold mines in South Africa, as was his uncles and brothers, several of whom died in the mines. 3 events in his early youth shaped his thinking. The first was the fact that the Portuguese in the late 1930s sent thousands of uneducated peasants from northern Portugal to Mozambique, in southern Mozambique, which was very fertile, and gave them the best land and took away all the Mozambicans' lands, including his father's land. The second thing was the Portuguese established fairs where you sold your products, and he witnessed his father getting paid 1/3 of the amount that white farmers got for the same produce. And the third was that the Portuguese introduced a system of forced cotton production in which all Mozambicans had to produce cotton at 1/6 the world price to fuel the textile industry. So even in even in the early days, even before his formative years, he had already experienced some of the impact of colonialism. But as Bobby was saying, he encountered it more directly as he was ready to go to school and in that period. because when he was 9 years old, the only schools in the rural areas were Catholic missionary schools. And that's because the papacy and Portugal had an alliance. And for him to go to Catholic school, to go to school, he had to convert to Catholicism, even though his parents were really avid Protestants and played a very important role in the Protestant church. So it was very dehumanizing for him and his family. The second thing was that he was only allowed to go to rudimentary school, which was up to third grade. And he was the first in his class, and it took him 6 years to get to third grade because the Portuguese presumed that no Africans were really capable of learning Portuguese culture and civilization. And even the best would have to do each year twice. And many of his colleagues took 10 years. And then but graduating from the top of his class, the Catholic teachers wanted him to go into become a priest, and he refused. He wanted to go to medical school, and they said that's preposterous. The idea of a preto, that's P-R-E-T-O, pejorative for black, going to medical school is outrageous. They did agree, however, to let him become a male nurse, and he became a male nurse, and in becoming a male nurse, he experienced, the hospital was in an urban area, he experienced all the racism of urban settings. So at the hospital, African patients were segregated from white patients. There was no food brought for them, so their families had to bring in food. They had terrible conditions, suffered high rates of illness in the hospital, and African nurses received 1/3 of the salary of their white counterparts. So it was in that moment that he became, now in the city, the capital, he connected with a handful of other nationalists, and inspired by Kwame Nkrumah and by the Chinese Revolution and what was going on in Algeria, and made plans to flee to Tanzania, where the beginnings of the Frelimo, the Mozambican liberation movement, took place. He was lucky to get out because a day before, a white pharmaceutical salesman heard from a friend of his who had been in the army that secret police were going to arrest him. This white pharmaceutical salesman ran to the hospital. He was friends with Samora, warned Samora. Samora snuck and by foot went all the way to Swaziland, Zimbabwe, and ultimately to Tanzania. When he arrived there, he immediately went to Algeria, and he was selected by Algerian freedom fighters to lead the second Mozambican brigade. That was in 1964, 1966. He became the head of the army in 1969. When Eduardo Milan was assassinated by the Portuguese, he became the head of Frelimo. And from the outset, he faced several immediate challenges. There was a great division within the movement. There was a lack of international support. Frelimo lacked arms. He lacked the military base. And not only were they fighting the Portuguese, but that was the front line of the West, because Portugal was a NATO ally. So he's fighting the West and also South Africa and Rhodesia. There were many questions that he posed right away because he was very thoughtful about the armed struggle, and it included who was the enemy. And he, unlike other people, he defined the enemy not as whites, but as the colonial regime. And conversely, he took a position that anyone born in Mozambique who chose to be Mozambican was Mozambican. And that included a large number of Asian Mozambicans and a handful of white Mozambicans. As regards the strategy that he employed, it was mobilizing peasants. He rejected the idea of urban violence because it would unnecessarily kill large numbers of people. And the objective was not just to drive out the Portuguese, but to transform society. He had 5 principles that governed his ideological thinking and his practice. First was a pride in his African past. He was very much an African nationalist. Second, a belief that you had to have an armed struggle, otherwise you'd fall into a neo-colonial trap. Third, he was anti-racist from the outset. In fact, he got into a big fight at Dar es Salaam with Black Power advocates who were there at a Pan-African meeting. He argued that you could have, if you could have Black Portuguese, which you did, who were in the elite Portuguese colonial army, you certainly could have white or Asian Mozambicans. And that was very important for him. And it was very important for us too. Fourth was a belief in the power of human agency. And finally, his commitment to Marxism. And I want to say a little bit about that, not only 1 minute, but I want to say one thing, 1 minute about that. And that is, most people thought this was interactional, what's the right word, when you trade something? Transactional, excuse me, thanks, Bobby. Because the Soviets and the Chinese were giving him arms. But he told me a very interesting story, which has now become pretty famous. And that is when he got to Tanzania, he was given a reading of Lenin, a reading of Marx in a short pamphlet. And as he read by a comrade of his, as he read it, he said to this comrade, I don't have to read this because I'm essentially reading it for the second time. And what he meant by that, as he experienced growing up all the contradictions and exploitations of colonial capitalism, and also he could see that the West was supporting the imperialist powers were supporting the Portuguese, and the socialist countries were supporting him. So he has a very deep connection to Marxism. It's not this superficial thing. Now, let me just talk for a second about his limits, because he was very popular, has enormous support, and was very successful, as they were in Cuba and Nicaragua, in social reforms, pre-education, housing, literacy, terrific job doing that. But he also, as did all my heroes, had a big ego and had clay feet. And although he was a good listener, once he decided something, he was fixed on that, and no one else could change him. Second, he accepted Marx's plans for economic development. He accepted, and therefore they had a state-based economy, and you really can't with two economists in the whole country. But that was what he did. Thirdly, he underestimated the power and the ability of the South Africans to destabilize his country. He had a very small army, and the South Africans had one of the largest armies and nuclear weapons. And yet he was not going to be intimidated by them. And fourthly, he overestimated his own military, the guerrillas who won the war. He would say to me, Alan, when we would talk about South Africa, he said, Alan, don't worry. We beat the Portuguese with 100 young men and women. We could take on the South Africans. And I, being a very good militant, sometimes these were in private conversations, other times they're in groups, I would applaud like everyone else. So we conceded a certain amount of analytical something rigor. And that's what I want to talk about now. The last challenge, that is the problem of writing this book, apart from the problem of writing with someone so smart and so super critical like Bobby. So the first problem is a lack of sources. Many of the earliest documents, in fact, all the period from 1960 to 1974, they were shipped from Dar es Salaam to the capital Mozambique, and they all fell off the boat. Every single document fell also. So there's no archival material from that period. The second is that the period from 1975 until he was assassinated by the South Africans, 1986, are in the Frelimo archives, and they're closed. So the evidentiary base is very difficult. I've been able to get a lot of material he has a small personal archive, which was useful. And finally, from the Russians, East Germans, and Cubans, we've been able to get things. And then, so we had to write primarily using oral sources. And we interviewed some 200 people, many of whom figured prominently in his life. Unfortunately, many others passed away during this 60-year period. But apart from the problem of people dying, there was a problem of memories forgotten. So the person who encouraged us to write this book, a brilliant guy named George Rebello, who's the head of ideology and one of the few intellectuals in the movement. He said, you know, you should write a book like that because our children and grandchildren don't know anything about this period. And we said, fine. And we said, George, can you tell us this? Or could you tell us that? And he couldn't remember a thing. So there was the problem. He stimulated the idea, but he couldn't add anything to it. There were also competing memories, which I'll be happy to talk about. There were also the fact that memories are manipulated to reflect contemporary realities. And I'll be happy to talk about that. And then finally, there was the challenge of his personal life. We wanted to do more than just do a narrow political history. I read an article by MJ, which was very instructive. And we tried to get a lot of interviews with his children who talked about how he could be a great father, but also a nasty father, which gets me to the final point. And that is the question of writing from a position as a partisan or as an engaged scholar. I don't believe in objectivity. I don't believe there's a history, but there are histories in the plural. I don't believe that there is a biography, but there are many biographies. And so writing from that position and writing as an engaged scholar committed to challenging social injustices and oppressive institutions, and committed to challenge critically and criticize the cause movements and the men and women we admired, I went ahead writing this. Bobby, as if any of you read the introduction, Albie Sachs, a very prominent lawyer, got it right. He said that I'm much of a romantic and Bobby is the cynic, and the combination of
he said skeptic.
A skeptic, and the combination of two. But anyway, I took the position that this was our biography of Samora Machel, and in the introduction, I invite other people of different perspectives and different leanings and asking different questions to write the biography that they want to write. So that's the history of this book. The only thing I just add is that we're writing a much larger book, and I would be very happy to receive any suggestions and criticisms on how we could make it better. Sorry I took so long. Go ahead.
So one of the things that you have to really understand is that we lived in Mozambique with our family for 17 months in 1978 and 1979. And so we were participants in a lot of the things that we wrote about, and we observed a lot of them firsthand, and our friends observed them as well. And we always discussed them. There were 17 Americans that were working in Mozambique when we lived there. And all the foreigners were called cooperants, which are cooperators. A lot of them came party to party, like the Italian Communist Party or the Chilean Communist Party, or the Russian Communist Party. A lot of them came government to government. People from the West did not, although
that's right.
I mean, people from Britain and the United States came as individuals, and we all knew each other, and we all interacted, and we all learned from each other's experiences, because all of our experiences were somewhat different. But a lot of what we wrote, what we ended up writing about, were things that we actually knew firsthand. So that's a little bit different than probably the normal way that people would write a biography of somebody who is dead. The other thing is that Alan and I didn't always agree on what was going on around us that we were observing and discussing. So we had a big argument. This is just indicative. Huh?
Not about the spirit meeting. Go ahead.
Well, about the Mozambicans had this ridiculous thing that they did. At 5 o'clock, all the flags would be lowered. And so people started, when they saw the flags being lowered, they would stop their cars and they'd get out of their cars and they'd stand at attention because the national flag was being lowered. Well, then it became that if you saw somebody outside, standing outside their car because the flag was being lowered, even if you couldn't see the flag, you were supposed to get out of your car and also stand at attention. So the entire city of Maputo stopped functioning at 5 o'clock, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. And Albee thought was great revolutionary solidarity.
That Albee was a Supreme Court justice, and I was in between them.
So that was the level on which we discussed a lot of these things. And so when it came to writing this book, my perceptions of some of the people in it maybe were a bit different than Alan's perception. So I think that really broadened how we looked at things. Yeah. And I didn't really feel that I was writing it as a partisan, because I never felt like I was Mozambican. Alan felt like he was Mozambican. He wished to be Mozambican. He wanted to be involved in this great revolution that was taking place in Mozambique. I felt more that I was an observer. And I think that probably is, I mean, that we wrote things from those two different perspectives.
Right. So, and we're still happily married after what was a very intense set of arguments about stupid details and some important ideas.
So Alan did the initial writing. He wrote the first however many drafts. 6 or 7. And then I went through each of the chapters and I made lots of suggestions of ways of moving things around, and also things that he didn't have in there that I thought needed to be in there, and things that he did have in there that I thought needed to be excised. And that was a really difficult problem because we had a page limitation. And in order to talk about this person, we really had to talk about his society, because you couldn't just talk about him in a vacuum. So there had to be discussions of colonialism and discussions of Frelimo ideology, even when it wasn't directly related to him. And so we have to be really careful about what kinds of things we put in there. And what we left out. And that's one of the reasons that we're writing this other book, because that one won't have the same constraints. And that one will be a much broader history also of Mozambique in the late colonial and post-colonial period, because as much as he affected what Mozambique became, Mozambique affected what he was allowed to become.
Okay, so we'll stop. Sorry we took so long, but that's an interior view, the inside story.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think that you've presented us with a lot to talk about. Would people like, there aren't any questions in the chat. Well, I'm sure there will be. I know this audience. You sort of seeded us to ask you questions by saying there were things you would be happy to talk about. You talked about the issue of competing memories and said you'd be happy to talk about competing memories. Could you give us a specific example and talk about how you talked about it?
So for instance, when Samora Machel went to train with the first guerrilla group in Algeria, there was another prominent nationalist figure who was a strong proponent of Black power and didn't like the idea that there were white Mozambicans and Asian Mozambicans training, and they tended to have superior positions because they had relatively high educations. So Samora and this other person got into an argument, and that's when two people who were there tell us a very different story. Mm-hmm. One person said it took place in the capital, and the other person said it took place right near the Moroccan border, the most remote area. One person said the other person instigated it, and the other person said no, it was Samora instigated it, and they each had an elaborate story. In one case, another person intervened. In the other case, Samora, who was a big boxing fan and was proud of his large muscles and gymnastics, knocked him out. Now, both people were there, and it was very important because the knockout fits into Samora's machismo, into the fact that he was a boxer, into the fact that he was a guerrilla leader, as opposed to the other story in which someone else intervenes and calms them down. So that's just one example. But let me talk about memory in a different way, Anne. After Samora was killed by the South Africans, a new government came into power, and it was pressured to abandon the socialist project and adopt the IMF World Bank neoliberalism. And the new president did that, but at the same time, he erased Samora from history. So from 1987 to 1996 or so, you find almost no mention of Samora in the newspapers, in any official documents. But in the same period, there was a proliferation of rap music, and Samora becomes the featured subject of rap music. So among young people and among poor people who had boom boxes, they would sing these songs which were part praise poetry and part Rastafarian music about Samora and all his strengths. And it was very romantic, of course, but these two different histories, two different memories of Samora existed side by side.
Thank you. So Richard Chapman has asked if you would be willing or be interested in talking about the role of religious communities, both in the struggle generally and in Samora Machel's thinking and organizing. Are there any parallels to the popular church in Nicaragua?
No, there weren't, because the Catholic Church there was no such thing as liberation theology. The Catholic Church was in bed with the Portuguese colonial regime, and in every single respect. So to the extent that there were popular, progressive religious expressions, it was in Protestant separatist churches, which were known as Zionist and Ethiopian churches, which were autonomous from the evangelical missionary churches and created a hybrid religion which celebrated African culture and African agency. There were a handful of Catholic missionaries who came from Holland who covertly worked with Frelimo, but when the Catholic hierarchy found out about them, they were sent home immediately.
During the colonial period, there were lots of missionaries that came from Western countries, and some of them were Catholic, but there were also a good number of Protestant missionaries. And the Protestants had a different attitude toward education than the Catholic Church did. So those communities that had access, that had Protestant missionaries nearby, they didn't believe in this idea that that Mozambicans were stupid and they couldn't learn anything. And so they taught them, they allowed them to think about education. They encouraged them to become educated and to read. And they were way more progressive, even in a colonial situation, than the Catholics were. So if you look at the development of the people who were the leaders in Frelimo, they came largely from Protestant areas, and they had incorporated into their ideology a lot of Protestant attitudes toward family, toward sex, towards work, towards ethics, things like that. So after independence, it's very interesting. The Frelimo was trying to develop this concept of the new Mozambican man, meaning the new Mozambican family, socialist, which was basically a husband, wife, and children, nuclear family, and not the kind of extended families with multiple wives, which is what you had in what's quote unquote traditional society. So in creating the concept of the new man, The new man wasn't supposed to drink. New man wasn't supposed to smoke. The new man wasn't supposed to wear short skirts the new woman. They weren't supposed to go to clubs. They weren't supposed to get drunk. They were, when you dealt with them and they worked for an agency, they were supposed to care about you and not just ignore you and chat among themselves. So they incorporated all of these things from Protestant ethics into their revolutionary concept. I think unthinkingly. I mean, they didn't realize that they were doing it, but that's what they were trying to create in post-independence Mozambique.
So just to give you one example, and my sister Susan, who's on the phone, who's joining us, might remember this, but women who wore high heels were arrested, or miniskirts. And this was all part of the strong Protestant culture that infused Frelimo's Marxism. So we're very conservative in some respects in terms of social norms.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question, can you say something about the post-Machel legacy, both in Mozambique and Southern Africa? After Machel, it seems to me that Frelimo, at least as a party, managed to go beyond the trappings of one-man rule, in contrast to ZANU in Zimbabwe or Angola dos Santos. Do you think in Samora he had this vision of a democratic Mozambique that went beyond his captivating political personality? Of course, we'll never know because he was assassinated, but do you find in his political life that belief in creating a true democratic Mozambique beyond one man, one party rule?
I suspect that question was asked by Munya, but maybe
it was.
Munya wrote a wonderful book on Zimbabwe and political prisoners in Zimbabwe. No, I think that Frelimo was moving away from a rigid Marxism, but it was still committed to a Marxist-Leninist vanguard party as late as the time of his death. Now, I don't know in which ways Samora was thinking, although I know, because he told me several times, he had become very alienated from the Soviet Union for a variety of reasons. But they were committed. If you have a vanguard party, it's the vanguard party that speaks in the name of workers and peasants, and workers and peasants only had democratic rights or capacity to engage in debate at the very local level.
I think that intellectually, he thought that they were creating a democratic society, and that the wishes of the people should be considered. But the problem was that they all grew up attacking what existed. So they learned about opposition, but critical thinking. But then when they got into power, they couldn't figure out ways to incorporate that kind of ability to think critically at the lower levels. And so what you had orthodoxy just going up. And of course, he wasn't around long enough for a lot of the problems to surface. A lot of them surfaced later on, but they were trying to create a society in which all people were honored, were valued. And that's why they were fighting against the quote unquote traditional ideologies of forced marriages, right, and circumcision and polygamy. But they weren't very successful at it because they weren't really, the alternate vision wasn't really something that people would readily accept. So one of the problems, you can see in this little example, they wanted people to only have one wife, so you couldn't be polygamous. And so a man was only supposed to have one wife. Well, what happened was men were used to having children with several wives, one after the other. So when one person was was nursing, they wouldn't have anything to do with that wife. They would be with some other wife. Well, if you only had one wife, what happened was that women were being pregnant all the time. Their teeth were falling out, their bones were going bad, and the children were weaker and weaker because their mother didn't have the sustenance to produce them. So they had to figure out how to deal with that. Okay. So they went on this big campaign about spacing children, but they didn't really deal with, they weren't really able to deal with the issues. Like women had to work because everybody had to be part of the new society, but there weren't any concessions made to what happened in the off hours when women weren't working. In the household, women still were responsible for absolutely everything. And when women got pregnant and they had to leave the job, that really screwed up the production system. So they weren't really able to answer all of those questions. And then they gave up the socialist project altogether.
So to get back to the question of democracy, Frelimo and Samora had their own sort of definition of democracy, would hinge very much on social and economic justice. And because that was sort of a materialist perspective and vanguardism. So there were fundamental tensions to what our understanding of democracy would be.
Another question, how is corruption addressed within Frelimo post-independence?
So Samora is in death. Samora became a hero. He became the embodiment of anti-corruption, because during the Frelimo, his period, 1975 to 1985, there were few commodities available. We would often have to stand in line for several hours, but there were no members of the leadership who had private bank accounts, who had money stashed away. And in fact, when two did, they were fired immediately. So Samora is sort of as puritanical, stern, anti-corruption. Whatever we had, we all shared together sort of notion. Of course, he had a nice suit and some other things as the head of the state, but there was no private property or anything. When Frelimo was forced to adopt the World Bank, IMF prescriptions, including privatization, the new leadership used its powers, the power of its position, to amass enormous amounts of wealth. And there was an enormous amount of corruption in Mozambique, and there continues to be, which is one of the reasons Samora is so popular in death, because everyone remembers a time when you didn't have leaders with big houses. Now they have big houses, numerous cars, and the inequality is enormous in Mozambique.
During the period that Frelimo was in power, when Samora was the president, they tried very hard not to have corruption. Toward the end of the time, right before he was assassinated, there were a number of scandals and things were exposed about certain people in the government who were taking advantage of their positions. And Samora intended to deal with the problem of increasing corruption as soon as he got back from the visit to Zambia. Where they were meeting with other frontline nations to talk about the situation in Zimbabwe. But it was on the return trip from Zambia that the plane went down and he was assassinated, so that never happened. And then the people who took over, the people in Frelimo who took over, were some of the people who had been involved in the corruption already, and then it just became rampant.
Thank you. There's another question about you gave a wonderful example of a competing story about two versions of stories told, both of them told by people who were there. But how do you deal with that kind of thing in a narrative? Do you tell both versions of the story? Do you and do you frame it in a way which lets your reader know which one you favor? Or how do you deal with that?
So what I did was tell, in writing the first draft, and we worked on it several times, told both accounts and also explained why each of the storytellers might have told it the way he told it. So, and I just left it as ambiguous. There are just some things you can't know for sure, and other things you can know but don't know how to interpret. So,
So I think when Alan and I disagreed about where our perspectives were somewhat different, I mean, I think we kind of negotiated something that he could live with and I could live with if we really disagreed about something. And we didn't really disagree about anything major. We just disagreed about some smaller things. But obviously we spent a lot of time talking about it, both when we were living there, living through it, and then subsequently when we were putting this book together.
My effusive use of adjectives, for example, would drive Bobby nuts.
And an occasional effusive use of an adverb too, I see.
I suspect so, Anne.
I think I'm going to take my privilege as moderator to perhaps ask the last question, and that's, I know that you're working on another book on Samora, and aside from the fact that you will be able to have it be longer, because you won't have the same space limits, how do you see the book as being different than the book that you've written?
Well, in two fundamental ways. One, we only had a short chapter in the end about Samora's legacy and memories, and we could have written 40 or 50 pages. There's so many songs and rap music and praise poetry, and also the way that he was silenced. And for different people in government too, did it for different reasons. We couldn't talk about that. The second thing is I'm going to go back and do some more interviewing of some of the old guerrillas who knew him, if we can get back before COVID. And then finally, the third thing, which is really interesting, I've now gotten and read all the archives accessible from East Germany, from Russia, some from Cuba, and from the CIA. And so you get really interesting representations of Samora Machel talking about the same event. And so I think that'll be really fascinating, at least fascinating.
The last time we were there, we were working on the last edits of the book. But we also came in contact with an organization of ex-freedom fighters. And they were trying to create a library, and they were talking about oral histories. So we interviewed a number of them in the short period of time we were there, and then we haven't been able to go back since. But these were people who ended up in middle levels of the government in post-independent Mozambique. These were the people who were the teenagers and young adults who made up the army that fought, the people who went to Algeria to actually train, the people who went to school in Dar es Salaam and did training there, the people who served as runners for Frelimo inside Mozambique, the people who were helped to set up the first communal villages there. And so the information that they have is information that we were completely unaware of because we never had access to this group. And a lot of them went on to hold very significant positions because after independence, or even during the armed struggle, numerous people were sent to Eastern European countries, to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to other places to study, and they were involved. And then they met with Samora when they came back, and he put them in this position, and he told them to do this, and he sent them somewhere else on certain missions. And those are things that there was absolutely no written data about. So I think that if we are able to conduct more of these interviews, or well, right now, Alan has a graduate of the history department.
Yeah, Alda.
Who's a professor in Mozambique, and she's now starting a project where her students are going to be interviewing these people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So, I think that once we get this information, what we will be able to say about Samora will be so entirely different than what we said in this book.
So let me just end with one final comment. I started by saying Samora Machel was one of the two most significant leaders of Africa in the mid-1970s. That was precisely the reasons the South Africans had to kill him. They assassinated him, they brought down his plane, because he enjoyed so much for two reasons. Because he enjoyed so much popularity and captured the imagination of South African youths who were becoming increasingly militant in 1985, that he posed a real threat. And secondly, South Africa could not allow having a Black Marxist government on its borders, especially one that was reasonably successful. And it was until the South Africans destabilized Mozambique and brought the country to its knees. So there's a lot more to reason. Other people will write books that are not as flattering. I haven't gotten a chance to say anything negative, but he did have.
We did say some negative things in the book.
So the one thing I want to say about it, negative, is apart from the fact that he became more authoritarian as he became more desperate, he was very ambiguous and contradictory on women's issues. If you read through his book, in terms of politics, he's very committed to the emancipation of women, to women playing a role in the armed struggle. On the other hand, he had 3 wives and several kids. And when he became president, he insisted that the children from his first and second wife live in the presidency and not with their mothers. So.
Yeah, it's all very complex. Well, I can't thank the two of you enough. This has been really quite wonderful, and I think we're all looking. We'll have to come back when you finish the next book. So thank you very much.
Okay.
We will be meeting here again on February 16th. And Clayton just sent around a link to register for the next book club that will feature David Perry, who is both an alum and an employee. He is working as the advisor to undergraduates in the history department. And he and a colleague named Matt Gabriel have written a book called The Bright Ages, which is a sustained argument against the concept of the Dark Ages. And it came out on December 7th, and it's already gone into a second printing. It was written for a popular audience, and it is finding a popular audience. So I think that they will probably talk both about the concepts that they're working with, but also kind of how you position yourself to write for a popular audience, which actually the two of you, I think, did that in this book. I think that you were writing for people who are interested and curious about recent events in Africa. Clayton will send around an email which will thank you. There will be a link to this. We recorded it. We record virtually all of these presentations. And so if you missed something, you can still see it. And there will also be a link which will enable you to contribute to the history department if you are so moved. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for helping
all our wonderful friends. We really appreciate seeing all of you. I don't have a chance to say hello to everyone, but I'm sending you energy and love.
Thank you for helping Alan celebrate his birthday, probably in one of his favorite ways of celebrating, and that's talking about history with Bobby.
Exactly. Thank you, Anne. Great. Bye-bye, everybody.